Philip Stoughton from My House to Yours. Welcome to EMS and the Economist. I am joined once again by Sean Dubravek, who is traveling somewhere in the US. Sean, you have been on the road for a while. How are you feeling?
We're doing good, Phil. It's good to see you. Yeah, we've been on the
Yeah,
road for a bit.
yeah. It feels like we constantly talk about tariffs, and I am going to get to that because the news is kind of moving so fast on that. I think it's really interesting for our audience audience to hear about that. But what I want to start it with is kind of where we are with the latest book to bills for EMS and PCB, and what you're seeing in terms of change in the sentiment report.
Yeah, I think the book to bill both for EMS and PCB have been pretty strong. Uh, we we asked some questions in some recent surveys of members if there was some pulling forward of orders.
Mm,
If they felt like some of this was being pulled out of sync just because of the fear of tariffs and trying to get in front of
mm,
tariffs. And I think there's a really interesting dichotomy at play right now because the majority of IPC members that we spoke with suggested that they weren't necessarily pulling things forward. In other sectors of the economy, it didn't feel like they were pulling things forward. If you look at retail sales, for example,
mm,
in the U.S., Easter shifts from March last year to April this year, and
mm,
so there was some sense that retailers weren't pulling things forward as well because with Easter showing up later, there really is a seasonal shift in the type of apparel that they would be bringing in, and so they probably didn't pull things forward. But if you look at the import numbers in aggregate, we've in the last month had very strong import numbers that are
mm.
going to weigh on the GDP numbers in the first quarter as a result of how strong imports were, relative to exports. And so I do feel like there is the risk that some of what you're picking up in book to bill is pulling forward as much as possible
Mm.
to get in front of
Yeah,
tariffs and get in front
potential
of other
tariffs.
things. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but all in all, the numbers have held up okay, and look pretty strong. And certainly from the companies that I speak with, and probably similar to you, the companies you heard from, things are pretty good. They're seeing a lot of
Mm.
activity, seeing a lot of interest, and so I think there's a big question mark of how long that will sustain.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's quite fascinating where we see things at the moment. In the US, I think people are quite positive. In Europe, people are more positive about 25 than they were about 24. We saw that double-digit decline last year. We're looking at maybe a single-digit improvement this year, which I think everybody would be happy with. I think the challenge at the moment is that whole unknown, which we've talked about before, that slows people down in terms of their capital investment, in terms of planning their footprint, and that's created a bit of a challenge. And just in the news this week, we had some really rapid movement in the stock market, and news broadcasters were using the R word, the recession word again. Where do you see that influencing the industry?
I think it's definitely a headwind. I think that there
Mm,
is a lot of uncertainty, and anytime you see uncertainty, that causes companies to pause, especially when it comes to bigger, longer term,
mm,
longer horizon investments. And so I do think that all of the uncertainty does have the potential to pause those longer investments. I think there's that frenzy that happens right there at the beginning where people are trying to uh, pull things forward or close decisions quickly to try to get in
mm.
front of it, and then you get this malaise that sets in as they reassess the environment. And I think there's a lot of reassessing going on now. I think as you noted, it doesn't play out equally. Some of the shifts that you've seen in U.S. foreign policy just in the last 45 or 46 days are beneficial for certain sectors in Europe. And so you see what is a headwind in parts of the U.S. shifting to a tailwind in Europe. And so there is this global repercussions that are playing out now as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I was going to say the elephant in the room is tariffs, but really the elephant in the room is is White House policy. What's coming out is having a huge impact. You talk about what's going on in Europe. The big news in Europe in terms of impact is a rise in defense spending. That's based on a negative meeting with Ukraine and a reduction in defense spending then. But then in the last 2 days, we've got talk of a ceasefire that Trump has agreed with Zelensky and support, at least with intelligence at the moment. So it just feels like the whole tariff situation and general policy situation is leaving people in this position where they cannot really predict what's going to happen next. And it's really hard to, make investment decisions or geopolitical manufacturing geography decisions without that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think when you look at the broader economy, though, at least in the U.S., it's holding up pretty well. Like at least for now, despite the fact that there is a lot more discussion about a recession, things are holding up okay. The employment numbers last month were okay. They were, a little bit stronger than they had been in January, a little weaker than we had anticipated, but not too bad. I think there's still some sense of, will the significant layoffs we've seen within the government start to materialize, and will that weigh other sectors down? Will that impact hospitality? Will that impact retail? And will that drag down? Unemployment ticked up a little bit, but still within a comfortable range. So there is still this sense that despite all of the uncertainty, the underlying economy is holding up okay. And I think one could also suggest that the U.S. economy was doing quite well and was in a position where it could potentially weather some of these dynamics. Now, to what extent it can weather that, I think remains to be seen. Certainly, the uncertainty is weighing on the economy, and you are seeing the probability of a recession over the next 12 months increase. And so I do think that the risk of a recession in the U.S. has increased. Obviously, the correction you're seeing in the stock market isn't helping when it comes to that. And also the seemingly indifference from the White House around a recession doesn't seem to be, that kind of fuels the fire as well, when what you hear from the administration is, recession isn't off the table. Maybe there's some short-term pain that we're going to feel, and maybe that looks like a recession, but we'll get through it. So,
yeah, it's a big challenge. When we look at tariffs, obviously there's the tariffs that have been on and off with the near neighbors, and that one seems to have been the hardest to predict. We get a tariff that comes on, it's delayed for a month. We get a month down the line, it goes back on again, and then we get exemptions for everything that was inside the USMCA. It's really hard. If I'm a contract manufacturer in Mexico or a contract manufacturer, just across the border in Toronto, I don't know what to think. It's a big challenge in terms of planning their business. And if I'm a European and I'm looking to invest in the Americas, Mexico looked like a really great hot option. Now a lot of those companies are having to think, well, actually maybe we need to be in a maybe in a lower cost state, but we maybe actually need to be in the USA.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think if you look at the exemptions that were put into place for USMCA, that creates this whole, area where there's some uncertainty because there were a lot of products coming through Mexico and Canada, a significant share of products coming through Mexico and Canada that weren't certified USMCA because they didn't need to be. They were already coming through tariff-free. Things like computers and Mexican beer. Beer was already coming through tariff-free, so it's not necessarily coming through. And so there are all kinds of dynamics now where beer from other places is coming through tariff-free, but through Mexico, it theoretically should have a 25% tariff added to it, or Canada should have a 25% tariff added to it, because they weren't claiming USMCA exemptions because they didn't need to, because they were already coming through with very low tariffs. So the USMCA only covered up about 50% of the imports that were coming through Mexico, and even less coming through Canada. And so now there's this gray zone of, well, what does this mean for, again, things like Mexican beer or Canadian beer, and what does it mean for computers or mobile phones or some other categories that now get kind of caught up in that gray area?
Yeah, I'm curious when we go broader and we look at the tariffs and the tariffs that are being placed back on the US in the opposite direction. It feels like the relationship with Europe has changed quite a lot. We've also had the elections in Germany. We've had this news that there's going to be more spending on defense. There's been debt ceiling raised in a lot of the European countries, including from the EU itself, as to what can be rules on what can be borrowed, and if it's being borrowed for defence, that seems to be pretty limitless at the moment, which is great news if you're an EMS and that's your big sector in Europe. But it just feels that it's a time where we've just got to be really sensitive and keep a very close eye on that kind of US-European relationship. How do you see it from your side of the pond?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think it's clear that the tariff narrative is not over. We're nowhere close to the end. And so while there have been some exclusions, everything feels very temporary. It's hard, I think it's hard to imagine that at some point the Trump administration doesn't turn more attention to Europe and look to impose tariffs on Europe. I think there's still a lot of unknowns, but I think that the administration is certainly changing its historical relationships with Europe, and I think that will materialize in things like tariffs still to come. So the focus lately has been North America with USMCA, Canada and Mexico. It's been focused on China. It's focused now on, in more recent days, on steel and aluminum. But I do think that you will see, Europe get swept up in the tariffs, and we'll find out what that looks like. But I think there's still a lot more to come. It is clearly the negotiating leverage that the administration wants to use, and you've seen them use it in other ways as well to negotiate terms for certain things. And so I think it in many ways is the easy button that the administration wants to use to achieve broader objectives, and I think that will impact the Europe-US relationships directly.
Yeah, I think it will, and it's not just about tariffs, Sean. To be honest, it's there are many issues in there, and it's kind of Europe's very sensitive to not just what the US says, but the way it says it, and the way it's saying it now is somewhat different to perhaps the way it said things in the past. And I think from the other side of the pond, it kind of feels a bit of a strained and strange relationship, and I think it's going to take some time for that to play out. And maybe the stance that's been taken on things like the war between Russia and Ukraine feels a little bit uncomfortable for Europeans. But what we have achieved potentially is a ceasefire, at least from the Ukrainian side. Hopefully we'll get the same from the Russian side, and it may well be that kind of approach actually delivers some value. So it is really a watch this space situation with that relationship.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting to see if, as you pointed out, that Europe has shown a renewed interest in investing in defense. Will that continue, or will that wane? Will a ceasefire, remove some of the wind from that sail, or will Europeans continue to want to invest in defense? I think there is potentially less willingness to trust a Russian ceasefire over a longer term, and so I think there has been as you've noted, a clear shift in European policy to some certain things that they have frankly neglected in recent decades, and now there's renewed interest there, and so I think the question will be, does that renewed interest continue? And if so, I think it means a structural change in the industry in Europe, because as certain categories continue to experience headwinds, you think about automotive, or you think about even in industrial and some other sectors, you see a clear tailwind when it comes to defense, and so I think that will continue for at least the coming years.
Yeah, I think it will, and I think actually, I think it's a little bit of a realization that Europe has perhaps depended on the US for defense, and actually it's got to do its own thing. The one thing that always upsets me is that it just seems that when governments are increasing spending on defense, they're reducing spending on aid, and it just feels like it's being pulled out of the wrong column to put in the other column. But it's kind of one of those things. We're going to see each other live next week. We'll be at Apex together on Tuesday. Have you got anything big scheduled? Are you presenting at Apex, or are you just getting everybody together and getting all your data ducks in a row and making sure you've got all the pieces of the jigsaw together?
Yeah, I'm not presenting myself, but I am looking forward to all the great conversations that take place at Apex, and I do think we will get a much clearer view on the sentiment in the industry, and how people are feeling about growth broadly in the industry. So I'm looking forward to those touch points.
Yeah, and Sean, much as I see you as the Economist guy, I also see you as the AI guy. So in our scheduled conversation, perhaps we'll put economics and tariffs to one side, just for a change, just for a day, and talk and dig deep into another topic. That would be fascinating.
Yeah, I was going to just add, there's so much happening in that space.
Absolutely.
I mean, as far as a real momentum in technology, I'm just back from MWC as well, and you just see tremendous appetite and tremendous growth in new devices, new applications, new hardware. So there is a lot happening in technology right now, which also it can sometimes be overlooked because of all of the geopolitical dynamics, but we are seeing real progress in a lot of areas there. So, and a lot more to come.
Yeah, you're right. And much as the economics might be the wave that sits on top, the actual steady growth in the industry is all about the ingredient technologies and the game-changing technologies that are out there. And clearly AI is probably one of the biggest of those. And, its huge consumption of energy is creating another important sector for electronic manufacturing. Sean, safe travels back home. Enjoy your weekend at home. I'll see you in Anaheim next week. And thanks so much for your time on the show today.
Yep. See you soon, Phil.